I'm Ellen O'Shaughnessy, coordinator of the Conversations and Coffee. And just a week ago, March 1st, I said, oh, happy day, it's March. We welcome spring. It's all my fault. And our friends in Old Saybrook, Connecticut got walloped with how many inches? I don't know, it was just coming down and coming down. And
my sister in New Jersey had 14 inches.
oh, okay. What was it?
I said my sister in New Jersey had 14 inches as of about 9 o'clock last night.
Okay, well, that's just about it. Oh, joy. And our daughter said from St. Louis yesterday, Mom, I was driving to work and I could hardly see a thing. And I thought, that means we'll get that. Well, this morning, about whatever time it was anybody else driving in it? Half-mile visibility, these huge flakes came down. Yeah, you were surprised at Mother Nature up to shenanigans in this month of March, huh? And we are, however, all here. So welcome to you, and we have a delightful time ahead of us with AnnSilverman sharing with us this amazing, what would you say, experience with paper.
Sounds good.
It sounds good, she says. And paper that we just take for granted and we don't relate to very, what would it be, caringly, appreciatively. We just take it for granted.
It's usually stuff we have to recycle.
Stuff we have to recycle. But your relationship with paper started how many years ago?
Well, my relationship with paper started as a youth, doing sketches and going to art stores and looking at drawers full of paper and finding them incredibly beautiful and a little intimidating. Because they were just too beautiful to draw on. So I've had this relationship with paper that paper making I began in.
Now they're all here. I think they want you.
Okay, paper making I learned how to do right here at the Cultural Arts Center in the early 90s with a class that I took from Shar Norman. I don't know if you know Shar. She's a paper maker and did classes here. So it was not until I really discovered how to make paper that I really got a sense of, this is the medium for my creativity. It's not so much drawing on paper, though I still like to write on paper a lot. But it was the making of paper and this engagement with plant life and the natural world and water, which is essential to making paper. So the process itself let me be in this middle space between water and plants and the natural world and what we use paper for today and have used paper for historically, which is recording our events, writing poetry, drawing. So there's this really intimate connection with human culture and human history that's involved with paper. And so my involvement is, as I say, in this middle place where I could think about both how we're embedded in nature and how we have used these products, developed these technologies that will advance our own emotions, our own ideas, our own way of sharing with others. And paper was a really integral part of that development.
Wonderful. You were born in Germany.
Your parents were military, and you traveled with them across the ocean, back and forth many times, and you became a multicultural person. How amazing. Tell us about this.
well, that part of that is just an experience that happens to a child of military parents, but it also opens up the world, and it opens up a connection to many different kinds of cultures. So when I talk about human culture, I'm talking about it really in a general and a broad sense. We spent time in Greece when I was young. We also spent time in Taiwan and the Philippines. And so I have these sort of connections to Western culture that emerged from the Greek experience, and Eastern culture, which has this sort of lovely, simple aesthetic and misty aesthetic. So it was a combination of multiple cultures that was a part of my growing up. Yeah.
You were learning language. You heard at 2 years old the German language,
Yes.
the English language.
So I spoke a little bit of German as a 2-year-old, like 2-year-olds do. And my parents did not speak German, so I would often be in the 2-year-old position of translating. So I would say, open the door. And then my dad didn't open the door. And I said, open the door. So that was my little translation at the age of 2. But yes.
Did you study Greek?
I did study Greek. When I was in Greece, I was like 11 to 12, 13. And we had a horse because my parents had promised us a horse. My sister and I were very, very horse crazy. So that was my experience of Greece. As a youth there, I was not interested in all those old rocks that people went and visited. So it was later that, in thinking about all those old rocks, that I said, what did I miss? So I studied Greek in college and wanted to know more about this ancient culture that I had brushed up against. So that was, I did not study art in college. I sort of did not think of myself as an artist. I sketched, and I would go around when we visited places and sketched people in Greece and sketched scenes, but at the time I was really more interested in finding out about this amazing culture and this amazing language. And let's see, after Greece, we were only in Taiwan briefly, so I can't really say much to that. We were in the Philippines for about 2 years while my dad was in Vietnam, sadly. But we actually got to visit him in Vietnam at one point. So the experience has been sort of broad across the world. My most recent, actually I don't know if it's most recent, but the one that's most connected to paper making was a trip that I was able to take with the help of the Ohio Arts Council to Myanmar with a group of paper makers that were dedicated to seeing indigenous papermaking techniques in Myanmar. And I took a workshop in Thailand at the end of that trip and learned a method of papermaking that is different from the traditional methods of papermaking that we think of, where you dip a screen into the pulp and pull it up and let the fibers settle. This was a method of papermaking where you had a shallow vat and a frame with cloth stretched, and you would put that whole frame in the vat so it had water, and then you would pour the pulps into that. And the way of forming the sheet was sort of spreading it with your hands and patting it until it was all evenly spread across this surface, and then you would lift it out from one edge, and that paper would adhere to the cloth as the water sort of left. And then those frames would be set up at an angle in a field with the sun to dry. And then you could pull the paper away from the cloth. But in this method, you could also put things into that paper while it was still wet, and it would embed things. You could carve out shapes in it with, say, a small frame that you would put in it. You could put in different pulps. that when you lifted that frame out would still have that blurry edge between one pulp and another as you lifted it up. Those papers were made in the Thailand workshop, so you can see where I have a... Sure. Sorry. So you can see where I've embedded some of this fiber and have some of a differently beaten fiber there. And these, if you can see, there's a really light shadow of whiter pulp in the kind of large textured pulp. And I set these up in this way. Actually, I just wanted to say, this wasn't an intentional, but it's really serendipitously lovely that this talks to that piece so beautifully. And when I thought of putting together this show and made this proposal, it was with Catherine's drawings in mind, and her really closely observed features of the world that were so emotionally full and still very simple and accessible, and they just sort of blew me away. So I wanted to have some sense of walking into a space that was quiet in a way, and the paper was leading you into the drawings. And you could think about the paper of the drawing, which I think about all the time, and the paper as its own sort of object. What I was going to say about these two papers, one of them at the top has a décollage, and the décollage means that ruffly bit when you pull the paper away from the frame that's left on it. So when someone talks about a décollage, they're talking about that ruffle. The frame that sits on top of the screen is called a decal. And that's what the term is. Most of the paper that we use has a straight edge, so that one is a trimmed paper without the decal edge, just to sort of talk about those features of paper making. Now they've got machines that can actually duplicate the decal edge, so it's not necessarily a marker of a handmade sheet of paper, which it used to be. The other thing... Sorry. I will go around the other way next time. I will pass this around. The other thing that I wanted to show you and talk about was paper made from bark fiber. And paper originated in Asia, and a lot of that traditional paper making fiber is still harvested from the mulberry plant and other very indigenous shrubs. And the bark fiber would be steamed away, and it has an inner bark, which is this lovely color, and the outer bark that we think of when we think about bark on stuff, which is the brown bark. And this has been steamed and then cleaned. So I've scraped the brown bark off. And then after this, it will be cooked in an alkaline solution of water and, let's see. If you can think about, there's something that is added to pools that counteracts the acidity that builds up in a pool. It's similar to that. And if I'm out of soda ash, which is what I would order, I can get this pool additive and do the same thing. Or laundry detergent. Generally, you want the unscented. Anyway, it gets cooked until it's soft, and when it's soft enough to tear against the grain, it can be beaten. And there are various beating methods. The ones I saw in Myanmar, traveling to these communities that still make paper in a very traditional way, it's beaten by mallets, beaten by hand. They developed another kind of beater in Europe, which has traveled across the world. It's called a Hollander beater because it was designed in Holland. But anyway, I'm going to pass the bark around just so that everybody can see it. There's still flecks of little bits of brown bark on it too. And though I'm not going to make you all get up and walk around, that long piece on the other side is made with the mulberry fiber without all of the brown bark removed. So the flecks in it, it's all still from the mulberry plant, but the flecks in it are still the bark that remained on the, after I stripped it. And I made that piece just to the sheer pleasure of making paper. So it was just sort of this lovely, I just did it for a long time. As I said, it was the paper making process itself that drew me into sort of my creative practice. But I still kind of touch base with that process, this interaction of plant fiber and water and the way it sort of settles randomly on a screen and then dries, and magically it's this surface that we can draw on, write on, and interact with. And I'll just, actually, let me just ask if anybody's got any questions, and then I can talk about individual pieces.
How do you put pieces together? I mean, obviously you don't have a screening with
Right.
that.
I worked on pulling one sheet at a time, and while they're wet, and I like to dry paper on a board or just a flat surface against flats. So if you put the wet sheet on your board and you overlap it with another wet sheet, they will combine. They've got to be wet, because what happens with paper is this sort of magical interaction between paper and water. Those cellulose fibers really have an affinity for water. There's this hydrogen thing going on between the hydrogen and oxygen, which we can talk about, but it gets boring. But as the water leaves, it pulls those cellulose fibers closer and closer together so that they actually form bonds. So when the paper's really wet, you can press the two pieces together, and because you've still got cellulose and water going on, as it dries, they will, stick together.
So the really long one, did you do that
Same.
all in one setting? Or did you
No,
have to
I had a large stainless steel 4x8 sheet. So I would do it the whole sheet, and then when it was dry, I'd roll it up and leave the edge, and then I'd use some methyl cellulose, which is like wallpaper paste, so I would add that just to make that connection a little bit stronger, because when you're connecting wet paper to dry paper, it doesn't do that same thing of adhering to each other. So I would just keep on rolling it up and then keep on making more. So it stayed in one sheet, but it did get some extra help when I was adding the wet paper to the dry paper. And this piece, it's all entirely mulberry bark made from this bark that's going around. And I actually grow my own mulberry in North Carolina. So again, I love that engagement between the dirt and the plant and the water and sort of cleaning and all of those sort of earthy, wet smells. And these strips that are going through it, kind of like the wiggly stuff in that tall piece, are actually pieces of the mulberry bark that haven't been beaten. So they've been cooked and they're soft. So I could make the entire sheet, again, with this overlapping technique. And then I could just take little pieces of the bark and stretch them across, doing this a la Agnes Martin thing, with these lovely lines across the paper. And then the figure was drawn in after it was all dry. So I drew the figure in sort of behind that bark. And that figure actually is from a photograph of an adorable little girl in Alabama. I was doing it was part of an okra festival, and I was making paper out of okra bark. So the okra stalk at the end of the harvest season is, you know, it can get pretty thick. And it's got a soft inner core, but it does have bark fiber on the outside. The cellulose is what makes plants strong enough to stand up. So you can find in flax is a grass, but it still has what's called a bast fiber, which is basically a bark fiber. And that's where the cellulose from flax comes from. Where was I going with this? Oh, Okra Festival. She was waiting to make okra paper. And she just had this most kind of shy, anticipatory way of standing. And she was this African-American girl with these bright blue glasses. Anyway, I just found her fascinating and lovely. No, I think that's mostly her hair, and then it was wrapped up. But anyway, that's the figure of the little girl waiting to make paper, which is why I call the piece Anticipation, because she's sort of there, she's there inside the paper or a little behind the paper, just sort of waiting.
And could you show us your grandmother's journals?
Oh, yes. And I will try and keep this brief because the story's... The story is really long. This scroll here was made after my grandmother died from shredded journals. She kept journals since she was a teenager. She died at the age of 93. She was this amazing woman. She started, edited, published Georgia Magazine for years, so she was always engaged with paper and ink and writing. But for years, she talked about how she wanted her journals destroyed because she didn't want anybody to read them. So it was over and over again, whether she should burn them, whether she should leave them out for the garbage. She never could turn loose of them, never. But she really wanted them unread. So I had this idea. I said, grandmother, why don't I come and we can turn them into pulp? Nobody would ever read them, and I could make this long scroll that would still reference your life with the materials of your life. I love the idea. She didn't. She wasn't going to give me her journals. But when she was dying, she was at my parents' house. She was my mother's mother. And to ease her mind, they promised to shred the journals. They brought a shredder to show it to her. And she even said, my mom asked, can Ann have the shreds when we've shredded them? And so she said yes. And they did. They sat in the laundry room with the shredder and shredded it after she died. And I got basically a haystack full of shreds. And I started making this scroll. The way you make recycled paper is you can take it and put it in a blender and with water, and the cellulose and the water really like each other, so they float around and you have pulp. I had a bigger beater for dealing with all of this pulp. And I started making the scroll, and it was quite long and getting quite longer, and the pile of shreds was not getting much shorter. So there was a show I did a while ago called The Journal Project, so I made other objects and other pieces that referenced her out of that. But this is the actual first idea of the scroll, which is why I call it Ancestor Nest.
Wouldn't you have wanted to read them?
In a sense, I'm sorry that they're not still around. I've gotten one fragment of them that didn't get shredded that was all about making the clothes for her children that she was going to take on a large trip across the country. And it was this lovely thing where she called on neighbors and friends to help her with the sewing. So that it was just this wonderful little snippet. But when she would pull things out of the journal, thinking maybe I should write a family book, they were usually how much the kids were irritating her. So the kids didn't want to read this journal. And since it was, she had talked so much about destroying it, it eased her mind to know that it would be destroyed. So after years and years and years of talking about how it would, she wanted it not read, the subject got tiresome, and so they shredded it.
Seems like a shame.
It is in some way, and it is honoring her in another way.
Nothing wants me to ask you to just go right up to it and touch it.
If you can sort of look through it in the light, you can see that there's some shreds that are still remaining in it that weren't part of the beaten pulp.
So what kind of paper was most of it? I mean,
It was all of it, her
no,
journals.
no, I understand that, but was it like today's notebook paper?
Oh, yeah.
Or?
No, a lot of it was, those notebooks that had sort of lines across them. I don't know what they're called. A lot of it was that. Some of it was yellow paper. Some of the color that came from this was because she used often a blue ink pen, so it turned into this sort of lovely greenish, bluish color. Actually, similar to the color of these pieces. And these pieces are entirely made of, again, recycled paper. I have a friend who is an architect, and she had kept a box of her notes and kind of drawings from when she was in school. And she didn't know what to do with them. And she asked me if I could sort of use them and make something that she could hang on her wall. So again, because of what I had already done, and because of this using paper pulp and using this process to kind of transform an experience and a record into something else that could kind of keep that around, but still be an object to look at and to appreciate on her wall in her house. So I did, but again, I had lots of it left over. So some of these pieces come from there, but it's interesting to me how the look of it, the color of it, is so similar to the colors that came out in my grandmother's journals. Oftentimes when you're making recycled paper out of sort of newspaper or newsprint, it'll turn out gray because of the ink. But I mean, I sort of love the way these colors came out. And this piece called Cells was made again with that vat, the shallow vat, on a screen that was, so not dipped, it was just poured. So I poured a ton of it in there. I needed to finish it up because at that point I had to leave my studio in North Carolina and come back up here because my husband had just been diagnosed with leukemia. So in leaving the studio, I did this really thick piece of paper, basically just to kind of keep it and see what was going to happen when it dried that thick. And to make the small round circle-y pieces in it, again, while it was wet and before I poured the other pulp on it, I set down cans of different sizes. So that I could put a different kind of pulp in there. So that's mulberry pulp, and
You're good at that. Dance.
well, having been burned twice. So I put the cans in there and put a different pulp in there. Then you can lift the can, then you pour the other pulp around it, and then you lift the cans out and let it dry at that point. And the reason I call it cells is because I had white blood cells on my mind at the time. And let's see. Actually, I've talked about most of them. There's that paper, which again, I did a lot of work that's not so much in this exhibit, where I used paper and walnut. And a lot of that walnut came from the land in North Carolina. A lot of it, my father kind of had milled and not used, and it was sort of beginning to rot. So I was picking out these odd-shaped forms and using the walnut and combining that walnut, the polished walnut, with paper. So as you can tell from a variety of these things, sentiment and sentimentality is a part of what's going on as well. The large piece in this corner, I was thinking about, the knitting that you can see is strips of muslin that were torn and knitted on very large needles. And I like the idea of handwork. I've always enjoyed the notion of what goes on in handwork, in needlework, and in paper making too. I can tell you about how they make it in Myanmar. It's this incredibly laborious process, and the labor that gets overlooked in so many of the things that we treasure. So the knitting kind of came out of both those ideas, and the notion of memory and how we knot together things that can still unravel at the edges, but become their own context after they've been knitted. That piece was made with overbeaten flax. Overbeaten flax has a high shrinkage, so I knew it would shrink around the knitting. And I made a pool with 2x4s, and we put plastic in there so I could fill it with water and put in the flax fiber pulp, then lay the knitting on top of that, and then add more flax fiber pulp on top of it. So it's encased in pulp. And then I just put the plastic out so that then it could drain and dry. And then it becomes this form which sort of partly encloses, partly opens. When I look at it in this installation, I think of seashells, I think of water. So it's got a lot of those things that I just like working with. Yeah?
So that piece, did you make it all as one big piece, or is that one that?
No, that's made as all one big piece.
Do you have like a big?
No, it didn't have a, I didn't have a.
So you put it on plastic?
Let's see, I may have actually had it on a piece of fabric that was in the plastic, but the plastic basically helped me form a pool. So I could make a frame, I could put up 2x4s of a certain size. I could put plastic sort of over that, so the 2x4s would keep the water in. So I was making my own little shallow pool. And then I could put the paper into that. It basically had to dry in place once I took the plastic out and let the paper settle, and then I had a piece that would dry.
Why did the paper just kind of all go in the plastic?
It was on, again, it was on a piece of cloth, so that I could pull the plastic away slowly, and the paper would settle on the cloth. It's very much the same, but in the opposite direction of lifting up that screen and letting the fibers adhere to the cloth. Then they would lift it gradually so that it adheres in a smooth fashion. Yes.
And speaking of outside, tell us about your collaboration of paper with honeybees.
Yeah.
Wow.
If you look me up, there's some pictures of me with this big bee beard. That came out of a chance meeting with a bee researcher at a Mardi Gras party. She was really fascinating. So she did bee genetics, and there was a bee lab at Ohio State at the time. And she was telling me that she'd worked with artists and bees. I said, And what she'd worked with a glass artist who did this sort of bell jar with a bust made of wax in it. And the idea was to watch the bees build on this bust, which was this lovely kind of combination of humanity in this human head and the bee structures sort of coming off of that. So I said, wow. And she said, but they didn't like the glass. And I said, I bet they like paper. So I made this hollow balloon form with wax hanging in the middle. And she helped get a colony of bees started in there. So I had this piece with this wonderful organic bee structure. You think of honeycombs as being rectangles, because that's how we do them. But left on their own, bees do this really wave-like kind of honeycombs. So I had this really organic wave-like structure inside the nest, or inside the balloon. And a variety of things went into that. In Myanmar, they've got this balloon festival, which they make with handmade paper. And these balloons are the size of hot air balloons. And they send them up at a certain time of year as prayers to the Buddha, who is kind of returning, had gone to his place in the heavens and was returning to earth. And this was this way of sending up prayers. And they were just amazing. They were carried up by a flame, and some of them had flames on the outside. So this notion of sending up prayers in this very fragile material was just, it's just amazing. So I wanted to make the balloon. So the balloon and the bees sort of came together at that point.
And here's a picture of you surrounded.
There's somebody in the back.
Would you like to see it?
So do you have,
I'm not. I wanted to keep bees, but I bounce around between North Carolina and Ohio, and you sort of have to be in one place to keep bees.
Well, I just want to say, I just love the intricate of this drawing of the road. I want to kind of ask you, I mean, is that just with charcoal? And then the wings are so, they look so beautiful.
Yeah. My co-exhibitor, Catherine Cox, did the drawings. And yeah, she works with graphite and she works with pencil. So it's all really closely imagined and closely observed. Features of rock, rope, water, cloud. And the red in this piece was just colored pencil. Just over and over again, lots of pressure, pressing out the textures that, you know, were in the paper. So just, again, lots of small labor. And I sort of, again, this combination of small labors creating these amazing objects that here speak to sort of emotional poles from nature, and paper having been this really powerful technology for humans. You had a question?
Yeah. The other artist who was here and took wool to make fabric used heat to make the fibers stick together. Now, is heat needed to do on the paper?
No. Heat's not necessary. Heat sometimes speeds up the drying process. But with paper, it's really just this simple interaction of cellulose fiber and water. They like each other, and then when the water disappears, it pulls the cellulose fibers together. When they're dry, and it's just a matter of getting them dry. And then they adhere and they become this object. You can't make paper out of proteins. Felting, a lot of that comes from wool and animal fur, hair, which is, I'm not a felter, so I don't really know, but that's probably why you need this sort of heat to pull them together. But you can't make, you can only make paper out of cellulose. So paper depends on plant life, because that's where we find our cellulose.
A large piece in the corner, how heavy is that? It looks, it almost looks like there's wax on it so that retains the form.
Yes, there is wax on it. So it's a little bit awkward and a little bit heavy, so you think of paper being fairly light. That one's a little bit heavier. The amazing thing about paper, I keep saying amazing thing about paper, is that it's seemingly fragile, but very, very strong. So you can embed heavy objects. I embedded an axe head in paper once, and the paper was very, very thin, but it still held up the axe. And that's because these fibers, once they connect, are actually quite strong. But it depends. Fibers have different strengths. So if you're using the bark fiber, the fibers tend to be longer than other fibers. So they've got a lot more kind of tensile strength. Also, if you use beeswax on paper, you get a translucency. So in a lot of pieces, I was really playing with that translucency. So that one's waxed too. Yes. Oh, I forgot to talk about that one. That was a piece I made on the floor with a blanket, sort of on the floor, and I did it, you know, again, that overlapping. And it's got a variety of fibers in it. It's got some okra paper fibers. It's also got some asparagus paper fibers. And if you think about asparagus and those woody ends that you take off, I work for a caterer, and when we've got a party that has asparagus and it's a big party, there's a lot of that woody stuff that comes off. So I said, well, let's see what I can do with that. So yeah, some of that is that. The round bit, this round piece is actually a cantaloupe. So aside from working with bees, I worked with worms, composting worms, and some of my collaborators. They love cantaloupe, and if you put it into the worm bin for a while, they'll eat all around it, and they eat the soft parts first. So what I was looking for is that lacy part of the skin on a cantaloupe. It reminded me of lace that we make, sort of this nature-culture connection again. So it's a matter of lifting that out when they've eaten as much as you want them to eat. So that was lifted out. And then there are these little pieces that are shaped like leaves that are made actually out of old lace, sort of again to talk about that back and forth. Other questions?
You're in the process of shredding and reweaving pages of the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. What does that mean?
It means that those people in the Abrahamic traditions are fighting one another and creating a lot of chaos in the world. So this was my way of thinking about that stuff and weaving them back together. So I was using a Greek New Testament, the Hebrew Torah, and Arabic. So I was using all of these languages and texts that were really part of the same tradition that we fight each other about on little grounds, little textural grounds. So it was just my way of sort of dealing with that.
What does the end product look like?
There were several of them that I did. One of them looked kind of like a book, which I also used walnut paper as part of the kind of frame or covering for that. And I've made some smaller pieces, which I don't have here. So I use them in other processes. I use them in a piece that was called Prayers. And I use them in sort of that shape that we see in windows, again, in all these traditions. kind of more curved in mosques and kind of more pointed in cathedrals. So
My initial thought was, wouldn't it be lovely in a book with blank pages where maybe a new story would get written?
that's nice. I still have some of this paper, so I may get to it. You had a question?
Yeah, the question I'd like to know is, the one here, the one at the front, I was wondering, what kind of pencil do you use for that drawing? Is it like use like maybe like a number 3 pencil or something?
Something, I think it was a number 2, but
Okay.
yeah, just
Because the way the marking of it looks like it's kind of dark.
just an ordinary pencil. And actually, if you look at it really close, you'll see the little pencil lines.
Okay.
So it's less, the pencil is more obvious in these paintings, in this piece, than it is in some of Catherine's pieces. You'd have to look really, really close to see kind of the actual pencil marking in hers. At a distance, some of them almost look photographic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You seem pretty knowledgeable. What did they use in Egypt for that first kind of, I have some of that.
Papyrus, you're talking about? Yeah. That was made from a reed called papyrus. Next time I'll lift it up. That was from a reed, but it's made differently. So it's not technically paper. It's woven in a way. So they would put strips in this direction and strips of it in that direction, and then they would beat it. So it's actually strips of this bark that were beaten together. So if you hold up a sheet of papyrus, you'll see that feature of it going this way and going that way. So it's beaten together. It's not, technically paper is when the fibers are totally macerated till they'll float in water. But it's the same interaction of the cellulose and water that holds it together.
So that's much like how when they use the linen, many years ago, 2000 years ago, when they weave the linen like that.
Right. Except I don't even know if this is technically woven. I think it's just laid in one direction and then laid in another direction and beaten hard together till those cellulose fibers start connecting with each other.
You and I were talking about the invention of the printing press.
And its influence on paper. Interestingly enough, as paper traveled from Asia into Europe, the use of the actual bark fiber didn't travel with it so much, so that in Europe, most of the paper was made from fabric. Now, the fabric originally came from plants, cotton from the seed fibers of the cotton plant, and flax or linen, they're both the same, from the flax plant, which is like a grass, which I think I talked about earlier. So there would be rag collectors that would collect old rags, old tablecloths, old shirts, and they would be sorted for quality and then beaten by, kind of like mallets, but they would make these stamper beaters that were really big and driven by water wheels. So the paper at that point was really, really strong. It didn't have a lot of additives the way we make paper now. So a lot of that paper has lasted for centuries and centuries and centuries, which is a little bit different from the paper that we make today, which doesn't have that longevity. But the printing press sort of generated a need for more paper. And we weren't wearing out our stuff fast enough. Yeah.
Didn't they write on lambskin?
They did. That was vellum.
So the royal family and this and that, they wrote a lot of stuff on
right.
lambskin.
So parchment is a kind of animal skin that was scraped and kind of rubbed and burnished until it was a good writing surface. And a lot of things were written on parchment, yeah. Vellum is the same thing, except it's calf skin from young calves. So it was a little bit finer than the parchment. But again, that was a really, really expensive and labor-intensive process. So paper was cheaper to make. So when the printing press was developed, they were looking for cheaper, quicker ways of making paper. And even before the printing press, the vellum was very luxurious, very expensive. So the Torah, I think, is still written on parchment or vellum because of that kind of increased value of the product. So with the printing press, and I think that partly that fabric origin of the paper made a paper that was a little bit thicker, a little bit more absorbent, so that it accepted the ink and the pressure of the lettering more readily than Asian papers, which were really wonderful for the brush. Yeah.
Rembrandt, on these little prints, they went to the printing press. What type of paper did you use?
I don't know the exact type, but I would imagine it's paper from cotton linen and clothing. But what happened as the demand for paper grew, our need for new technology also grew. So these technologies emerged from our needs. I mean, even paper emerged from a need. They were writing and recording on silk, which again was a very expensive, luxurious product. So the needs of having something that was a little bit more accessible. And what the printing press drove was a need to make paper out of something besides old clothing and tablecloths, because there weren't enough of them. And there was a French scientist who noticed wasps or bees chewing into wood and then making this very paper-like structure for their nests. So that's where developed our notion of grinding up trees to make paper, which is what we still do today. And it also pushed the technology of the automated paper machine called a foot reader. So you've got the paper beater that would beat things more quickly than the stamper beater, and then you've got a machine that would form paper on a movable screen in felt that we still use today. So I mean, paper making is a really simple technology, a really simple interaction, and we've just increased the speeds in which we can do it, but we haven't really changed that basic technology. The machine that makes paper now is still that same pouring technique. So they've got all of these little jets, and it gets poured on a screen that moves. So there were two ways of making paper. One was the dip method in the vat, and one was the pouring method, like I explained with the shallow vats when you sort of put it in. And we still do it, the same way. There's either a dip method or a pour method, and even the machine kind of pours.
I have a very conscientious colleague on a board that I'm on, and whenever she sends a word to us, she requests that we not make a copy of what she's sending on her cell phone. Save the paper.
Save the trees. Save the trees.
Save.
Right.
And I hope I remember to get back to that message on that cell phone without having that paper in front of me. What are your thoughts there,
Excuse me. I understand the desire to save the trees. Most of the damage, I think, that's done environmentally to trees is to cut them down for grazing purposes, for agricultural purposes, so that you take a forest, you remove the forest, and you put in fields for cows or places to grow coffee beans. So a lot of the trees in the rainforest in Brazil have been removed for cattle grazing. So there's this agricultural demand for big agriculture. And I think it's big agriculture that has a much more negative effect on trees. The paper industry thinks of a tree as a renewable resource. So they cut a tree and they plant another one. So it takes 30 years to renew, but a forester, I'm saying this because I also have this home and studio in North Carolina, and the woods right next to me are going to be cut down, which is really sad. But it's being cut down for paper, and it's going to be replanted by a timberman who will then harvest the paper and sell that pulp back. So I'm trying to wrap my mind around the fact that this is a renewable resource, and they're going to let forests grow back in this area. I still have problems with big agriculture and the way we do agriculture right now. So leaving smaller patches.
Well, I think we even do it with housing now. I think we all have all the trees at one point.
Right.
Down
Housing and development and the way we develop. And the way that we develop with a sprawling footprint instead of a vertical kind of smaller footprint. And, those things I think are changing, or I say to myself, they've got to change as we come to grips with the effect of our lost fauna on the climate and waters. Yeah.
Yeah, the recycling paper, people just throw away paper like it's nothing, but it's so recyclable.
Yes, it is. And everything is complicated. So everything, even when we think about environmental issues and environmentalists and protecting woods, there's still people and cultures that depend on certain crops. And with recycled paper now, I don't know how much energy is consumed in the manufacture and the process of recycling. So there's all of this sort of balancing. We don't want to lose a resource, but thinking about the ways in which we use that resource. So there may be a good call for saving paper, because even if it gets churned back into the recycling industry, there's still going to be this consumption of energy. So we want to balance consumptions of energy and what we take out of the system and what we can put back in. I'm running out of time.
I was thinking, because Michael, come on up here. Come on. Tell us what was named for you in terms of artifacts, preserving as an archaeologist.
Well, I'm not an archaeologist, but I have done archaeology on a volunteer basis for probably over 20 years now. And I have worked in particular with one gentleman from the University of Florida who works in the Caribbean, and he's a pre-Columbian specialist. So we've worked on various islands over many, many years now. At any rate, for the last 2 years, we've been working on a site on Long Island in the Bahamas that has been very rich in terms of the beads that we have found, and also has one of the first documented earth mothers within the Caribbean. And I got a note recently from him telling me that he was naming that site after me.
Yes. And how was it named? How was it named?
Oh, just my initials. Just my initials.
Which are?
MMD. But
That's cool.
If you don't read journals on Caribbean archaeology, Caribbean archaeology, you will know.
Well, thank you and congratulations. And that was truly amazing. Getting in touch with the earth, with your grandmother and her journals, and just the way you, from the time you were a child, integrated and fourth for us, Soul Talk. We loved it, did we not? Breaking the weather. Even though the door would open every once in a while, we get a little breeze.